Hello everyone, welcome to Daily Storyteller, and today I'm here to help you sleep. So before we begin, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments where you're from and what time you're watching. Lay back comfortably, relax, and let's begin. Story 1. It was the fall of 2018. The air was cool and crisp, carrying that faint scent of decaying leaves. I can still remember the crunch of gravel under the tires as we drove deeper into the woods. The trees seemed to close in, their branches forming a jagged tunnel above us. I had planned this weekend getaway for months. It was supposed to be a break from the grind, a chance for my friends and me to escape the city and disconnect for a while. The cabin was perfect, isolated, cheap, and surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. The three of us were ready for an adventure. Mike, my best friend since high school, sat in the driver's seat, his hands relaxed on the wheel. He was always the brave one, the leader. Sophie, my girlfriend, was in the back seat, fiddling with her camera. She loved capturing moments, especially those raw and unfiltered by city life. And then there was me. I guess you could say I was the one who liked planning things, making sure everything was just right. We were all laughing, the anticipation making everything seem brighter than it really was. Almost there, Mike said, his eyes glinting with excitement. You guys ready to rough it? Only if you're ready to lose at cards tonight, I joked, earning a playful punch on the shoulder from Sophie. But as we got closer to the cabin, the mood in the car shifted. The trees grew thicker and the road narrower. The sunlight barely made it through the canopy, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and twist. Then we saw it. A small, weathered cabin, barely standing at the edge of the clearing. It looked exactly like the pictures, old but sturdy. The windows were dark, and the front porch sagged slightly to one side. A single swing hung from a rusted chain, swaying gently even though there was no wind. Cozy, Mike muttered, though his voice didn't carry the usual confidence. I forced a smile. It's perfect. We unloaded the car and stepped inside. The cabin smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic. The floorboards creaked underfoot. Dust motes danced in the weak light that streamed through the cracked windows. The furniture was sparse, a worn-out couch, a coffee table with water stains, and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't seen a fire in years. Sophie walked around snapping pictures. It has character, she said, her voice echoing slightly in the empty space. Mike dropped the bags and stretched. Let's get unpacked and start the fire. It's going to get cold soon. As the sun dipped lower, we settled in. Mike and I chopped wood while Sophie prepared some snacks. The glow of the fire made the cabin feel almost warm, almost safe. That night, we played cards by the fireplace. The flames crackled, and our laughter filled the room. For a while, it felt like everything was normal. The outside world, with its darkness and cold, seemed to vanish behind the glow of the fire. But then, things started to change. It was subtle at first, a soft creaking sound like footsteps coming from the hallway. I glanced over my shoulder, but the hallway was empty. Did you hear that? I asked. Hear what? Mike replied, not looking up from his cards. I shook my head. Never mind. But Sophie heard it too. She looked up, her eyes narrowing. I thought I heard something. Mike chuckled. It's an old cabin. It's probably just settling. We went back to our game, but the uneasy feeling settled in my gut like a stone. That night I woke up to the sound of the swing outside. Creak, creak, creak. I lay still, listening. The wind was dead. The trees outside were silent, but the swing, it was moving. I slipped out of bed and peeked through the curtain. The swing rocked back and forth, the chains groaning softly. My breath fogged up the glass. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, just far enough away that I couldn't make out the face. The shape was tall and thin, almost blending with the shadows. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart pounded in my chest. I turned back to the bed and shook Mike awake. Mike, I whispered urgently, there's someone outside. He groaned, rubbing his eyes. What are you talking about? I swear I saw someone. He sighed and got up, grabbing the flashlight. We crept to the front door and stepped outside. The cold air bit into my skin. The swing was still now, hanging motionless. Mike shone the flashlight around the clearing. The beam cut through the darkness, but nothing was there, just trees and shadows. See? There's no one here, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. We went back inside, locking the door behind us. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and whisper the cabin made. Sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, Sophie was gone. Her bed was empty, the sheets tangled. Her camera sat on the floor, the lens cracked, my stomach twisted in knots. Mike, I shouted, Sophie's gone. He stumbled out of his room, his face pale. What do you mean gone? We searched the cabin, then the clearing. There was no sign of her, just the quiet forest watching us. I picked up her camera and turned it on. The last picture she took made my blood run cold. It was of the hallway, taken in the middle of the night, and in the corner of the frame, just barely visible, was a figure standing in the shadows, watching, waiting. We didn't stay to find out who or what it was. We ran to the car and sped away, the cabin disappearing in the rearview mirror. We never found Sophie. The police searched for weeks, but they came up with nothing. The cabin was empty. No sign that anyone had been there, but I know what I saw, and sometimes at night I still hear that swing, creak, 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 waiting for someone else to come and play. Story 2. It was the summer of 2019, and I remember the air being thick and humid, the kind of heat that makes your clothes stick to your skin. That was probably the reason we decided to go camping in the first place, to escape the sweltering city and find some peace under the cool shade of the forest. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just me, Jess, and Ryan, my two closest friends since college. We'd always loved hiking and camping, and this spot, Deep Hollow Forest, was only a couple of hours away. We had heard stories about the forest, strange disappearances, eerie sounds, but we brushed them off as urban legends. After all, we were just there to relax. We arrived at the campground around noon. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves. The sunlight trickled through the canopy, making everything look warm and inviting. Jess was the first to speak. "This place is perfect," she said, a smile spreading across her face. Jess was always the optimist, the one who saw the best in everything. She had a camera slung around her neck, ready to capture every moment. Ryan, on the other hand, was our practical one. He adjusted his backpack, glancing at the forest with a cautious eye. "Let's just make sure we set up camp before it gets dark. I don't want to stumble around here at night." I nodded, a chill running down my spine at the thought. Agreed. We found a small clearing beside a narrow creek. The water trickled softly and the trees formed a natural barrier around us. It felt safe. For now. As the sun set, the forest changed. The warm golden hues were replaced by shadows, deep and endless. The sounds of birds faded, replaced by the creaking of branches and the distant chirping of crickets. We lit a campfire, the flames casting flickering shadows around our little camp. We sat around the fire, eating sandwiches and talking about everything and nothing. Jess snapped photos of the flames, the sparks looking like tiny stars in the night. "This is so peaceful," she sighed, leaning back on her elbows. Ryan poked the fire with a stick. "Yeah, let's just hope it stays that way." I chuckled. "You're always such a pessimist." But Ryan's face was serious. "I'm just saying, we're out here alone. Who knows what's really out there?" His words hung in the air like smoke, and for a moment none of us spoke. The fire crackled, and the darkness beyond it seemed to grow thicker, as if the forest itself was listening. That's when we heard it. A faint, distant whistle. It was soft, almost like the wind, but there was a rhythm to it, a pattern that didn't feel natural. Jess sat up, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Ryan nodded, his face pale. "Yeah." I tried to laugh it off. Probably just the wind through the trees. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The whistle came again, this time closer, clearer, and then it stopped. We decided to brush it off. Maybe we didn't want to admit that we were scared. Maybe we were just too tired to think clearly. So we doused the fire and crawled into our tents. Jess and I shared one tent, while Ryan took the other. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the forest. The tent fabric felt thin, almost useless against the weight of the night pressing down on us. Jess was already asleep, her breathing soft and steady. I closed my eyes, trying to follow her lead, but then I heard it again, the whistle. This time it was right outside the tent. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it would wake Jess. The whistle was low and slow, like someone calling a dog, but there was something wrong about it. It was too deliberate, too precise. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. And then I heard footsteps, soft, slow, circling the tent. I wanted to scream, to wake Jess, to run, but my body wouldn't listen. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then something scratched against the tent fabric, long, slow scratches, like fingernails. My body finally obeyed me. I shook Jess awake, my voice a harsh whisper. Jess, wake up." She sat up groggy. "What? What's wrong?" "Listen." She held her breath. The scratching had stopped, but the air felt wrong, heavy and charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. Then we heard Ryan's voice, muffled through the tent wall. "Guys, let's get out of here now." We scrambled out of the tent, our flashlights cutting jagged paths through the darkness. Ryan was already packing up, his face pale and sweating. "What happened?" I asked. He looked at me, eyes wild. "There was something, outside my tent. I saw its shadow. It just stood there, watching." We didn't waste any more time. We grabbed what we could and started down the trail, our flashlights bobbing wildly. The forest seemed to close in on us, the trees leaning closer, their branches like skeletal hands. Then we heard it again, the whistle, closer, right behind us. We broke into a run, the path barely visible. Branches clawed at our faces, roots threatened to trip us, but we didn't stop. We couldn't stop. We finally reached the car, gasping for breath. Ryan fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. He yanked the door open, and we piled in. The engine roared to life, and we sped away, the forest blurring past us. I didn't look back. None of us did. We never talked about what happened that night. We didn't want to know. The forest, the whistle, the shadow outside the tent. It was easier to leave it behind, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the same whistle in my dreams. Soft, slow, calling out from the darkness. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to camp in Deep Hollow Forest. Story 3. I remember it like it happened yesterday. It was 2020, during the cold months of winter. The days were short, the nights impossibly long. I was working at a large distribution warehouse on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that always seemed forgotten, even in the middle of the day. The warehouse was huge. Rows of towering shelves stacked with boxes, a maze of metal and concrete. The air inside was stale, filled with the faint scent of cardboard and machine oil. It was my job to do the night shifts, keeping an eye on things, making sure everything was where it needed to be. I didn't mind the quiet. In fact, I liked it. No bosses breathing down my neck, no co-workers getting in the way. Just me, the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the distant sound of machinery ticking in the silence. But sometimes the silence was too much. It felt like the building itself was listening, watching. That's when the shadows started to move. There were only 3 of us working the night shift that week. Me, a 27-year-old just trying to make ends meet. Chris, my shift partner, 30 years old and always cracking jokes, though his laugh seemed strained when the lights flickered. Marcus, the security guard who spent most of his time glued to the screens in the control room. We were the night crew, the forgotten ones who kept the place running while everyone else slept. It was a Tuesday night, just after midnight. Chris and I were doing inventory in Sector 4, the oldest part of the warehouse. The shelves here were taller, the shadows darker. This section hadn't been updated in years. The overhead lights buzzed and flickered like they were struggling to stay awake. Chris sighed, tossing his clipboard onto a crate. "Man, I hate this part of the building. It always feels off." I nodded. "Yeah, I know what you mean. Let's just finish up and get out of here." We worked in silence for a while, the only sound the faint echo of our footsteps on the concrete floor. Then Chris stopped, his eyes narrowing. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I froze, my heart suddenly hammering in my chest. "Hear what?" He pointed down the aisle. "I thought I heard footsteps, but not ours." We stood there listening. The warehouse was silent again, the air thick and heavy. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread. "It's probably just Marcus doing his rounds," I said. Chris didn't look convinced. "Yeah, maybe." But deep down, I knew it wasn't Marcus. We finished the inventory as quickly as we could. By the time we were done, the silence felt suffocating. Chris was on edge, his eyes darting to the dark spaces between the shelves. "Let's get out of here," he muttered. We headed back toward the main area. The lights above us flickered again, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist on the floor. I kept telling myself it was just the old wiring, but my gut told me otherwise. We were halfway down the main aisle when we heard it, a soft dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Chris and I exchanged a glance, our faces pale. The sound was coming from behind us. Slowly we turned around. The aisle was empty, but the sound continued. Drag. 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 It was getting closer. "Run," I whispered. We bolted, our footsteps echoing wildly. We didn't stop until we burst into the main loading area, the harsh lights making us squint. Chris doubled over, gasping for breath. "What the hell was that?" he choked out. I shook my head, trying to steady my breathing. "I don't know, but it's not right." We looked back down the aisle we had just run through. The shadows were still, the silence complete. Whatever had been making that noise was gone, or hiding. We decided to check in with Marcus, Maybe he'd seen something on the cameras. We made our way to the control room, the door creaking as we pushed it open. Marcus was there, but he wasn't watching the screens. He was staring blankly ahead, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. "Marcus?" I said, my voice trembling. "What's wrong?" He didn't answer. He just lifted a shaking hand and pointed to the monitor in front of him. The screen showed a live feed of Sector 4, the aisle Chris and I had just left. At first it looked empty. Then we saw it. A shadow moved between the shelves. It was tall, impossibly thin. It seemed to glide rather than walk, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. It stopped and slowly turned its head toward the camera. Its face was wrong, blurred, like it was covered in static. But even through the distortion, I could feel it staring. It knew we were watching. Then it moved, fast, straight toward the camera. The screen went black. Marcus let out a shuddering breath. "I don't know what that thing is, but it's still in there." Chris backed away from the monitors, his face ashen. "We need to leave, now." We didn't waste time. We grabbed our things and headed for the exit. The air felt colder now, the silence deeper. Every step felt like a countdown, like something was waiting for us to make a mistake. As we reached the exit door, I looked back one last time. In the darkness beyond the loading dock, a figure stood, watching, waiting. The door slammed shut behind us and we stumbled into the cold night air. We didn't speak. We didn't look back. We just got in our cars and drove. None of us ever returned to that warehouse. The company shut it down a month later, claiming it was due to structural issues. But we knew the truth. Something was in that building, and it's still there, waiting for the next night crew to arrive.